My 7-year-old took my husband's work iPad by mistake. Her teacher called Horrified. Fire, hooking plot. I will never forget the call that froze my blood. It was a Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio, when my daughter's second-grade teacher rang me in a trembling voice. "Mrs. Parker, I think you need to come to the school right away. Your husband's iPad, it's full of files that no child should have touched." For a moment, I thought she meant work reports or business documents. But when I arrived, the iPad was on the teacher's desk, screen glowing, and I saw the kind of corporate evidence that wasn't supposed to leave a boardroom: confidential merger drafts, salary slush fund emails, and even unsigned legal agreements. My 7-year-old had carried into her classroom the very proof my husband had sworn didn't exist. And here's the twist. Instead of being horrified at me, the school staff looked horrified for me. The teacher whispered that the files didn't just implicate a company. They implicated my husband directly, his fingerprints all over a fraud scheme that could ruin not just his career in Chicago, but my entire family's safety. I stood there shaking, realizing that my own child had stumbled onto the one device that could unravel years of secrets. But before I could take the iPad back home, a man in a dark suit walked into the school office asking for it by name. Scroll background story. I am an older woman now, but at that time I was living quietly in Dayton, Ohio, trying to rebuild after years of being sidelined in my own marriage. My husband worked high up in a logistics firm headquartered in Chicago, traveling weekly while I raised our daughter. To neighbors, he was polished and charming, but at home, he had begun erasing me, cutting my name from accounts, keeping me out of decisions, and insisting all the paperwork was handled. I had no reason to question him until that morning when my little girl accidentally carried his work iPad to school instead of her own. That mistake, innocent as it seemed, uncovered not only betrayal but a trail of documents that would later force me into a quiet, dangerous fight for truth, justice, and survival. Chapter 1. My name is Margaret Parker. I am 72 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that sometimes the smallest accidents change everything. That morning in Columbus, Ohio, I was pouring my weak coffee into a chipped mug when the phone rang. My granddaughter's teacher, her voice trembling, said, "Mrs. Parker, you need to come to the school. Your husband's iPad was brought in by mistake, and what we found on it, I don't even know how to say this." I rushed to the school, heart pounding against the brittle bones of my chest. When I entered the office, the iPad was glowing on the desk. My 7-year-old sat in the corner, swinging her legs, not knowing the storm she had carried in her backpack. On the screen were documents that made the teacher pale, contracts unsigned, secret bank drafts, and files labeled Parker Logistics offshore. They weren't supposed to exist. My husband had sworn he was only a mid-level manager. But here was proof he was something else entirely. As I reached to take the iPad, the office door opened. A tall man in a dark suit walked in, his eyes scanning the room, and his voice steady as ice. "That device belongs to Mr. Parker. Hand it over." My blood froze. Was he here for the school, or for me? If you want to know how a grandmother like me uncovered not only my husband's darkest secrets, but also reclaimed my own name, stay with me. Chapter 2. To understand why that iPad mattered so much, you need to know what came before. For years I had been erased, not loudly, but quietly, one form at a time. My husband, Leonard, was charming to the neighbors in Dayton, Ohio. He mowed lawns for widows, shook hands at church, always with a smile. But inside our home, he told me not to worry about the bills, not to sign the checks, not to ask about the accounts. "It's all handled," he'd say. And slowly, like fog rolling in, my name disappeared from things that once bore it. At first, I thought it was love. He wanted to protect me from stress. But then my pension deposits began arriving late. Then the phone rang one night, a collector asking for me by name, saying our mortgage was behind. When I confronted Leonard, he laughed, saying, "Clerical error. Don't embarrass yourself." The shame burned hotter than the fear. So when the teacher called about that iPad, part of me already knew. I just didn't know how deep the rot went. And I didn't know my own child's innocent mistake would drag me into a fight against a man who had built his power on paper trails and silence. But that day at school, when the man in the suit reached out his hand for the iPad, I had to choose: give it up quietly or risk everything by holding on. Chapter 3. I hesitated, clutching the device as though it were my granddaughter's hand. The man's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Parker, I'll need that back. Company property. Company property. Not my husband's. Company." That word alone told me more than I was supposed to know. The teacher stepped closer, her body shielding me ever so slightly. "Sir, this is school property right now," she said, her voice wavering but firm. "It came in a child's backpack. We'll need parental clearance before releasing it." For a second, I saw fear flicker in the man's eyes. Fear of being stopped by a teacher in flats and a grandmother with shaking hands. I took the iPad home that night, hiding it in a bread box under old recipe cards. But when I powered it on in the dark of my kitchen, the files opened like a wound. Wire transfers to islands I'd never heard of. Emails marked confidential between Leonard and executives in Chicago. And then, in a folder buried deep, something worse. Photographs. Not of documents. Of a woman, younger, holding a child who looked just like Leonard. My knees buckled. It wasn't just business he'd hidden from me. It was family. I thought the betrayal stopped at money. But now I had to ask myself, who exactly was my husband when he walked out the door every Monday morning? Chapter 4. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house felt like Leonard's footsteps returning. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the iPad, the glow painting lines across my tired face. My granddaughter's soft breathing drifted from her room, and I promised myself she would not grow up thinking silence was the price of survival. The next morning, I visited an old friend, Harold, who had worked IT before retiring. I told him part of the truth, that I'd stumbled onto strange files, that I didn't know what they meant. He connected the iPad to his old computer, muttering under his breath, "Margaret, these aren't just work files. These are drafts, metadata. See here? Dates don't match. Someone backdated contracts." He looked up, eyes sharp. "This is fraud." I felt my chest tighten. Fraud was a word for television, not for my kitchen. But Harold wasn't joking. He printed out a few sample documents, telling me to hide them separately. "Paper trail beats memory every time," he whispered. That night, Leonard came home earlier than usual, his smile wider, but his eyes sweeping the counters, the drawers, the table. He kissed my cheek and whispered, "Did the school call you today?" I tried to smile back, but inside, my heart was pounding like a drum. How much did he know? Chapter 5. The days that followed were a blur of small terrors. Leonard was suddenly attentive, bringing flowers, offering to cook, watching me closely. It was his performance, and I recognized it now. He was covering tracks. But in his care, I smelled fear. One evening, as we sat in the living room, he left to take a phone call. His voice carried through the thin walls. The device was compromised. Yes, I'll handle my wife. She won't talk. She never does. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped my teacup. She never does. That was the story of my life, spoken like a weapon. I wanted to confront him, to scream, but instead, I slipped out of the house the next morning with the iPad tucked under my coat and went straight to a lawyer's office in downtown Dayton. A young woman named Claire listened, eyes widening as I laid out the files, the photos, the contracts. When I finished, she leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Parker, this isn't just marital betrayal. This is federal crime." At that moment, the door to her office opened without a knock. Leonard stood there, his face pale but his eyes burning. He had followed me, and for the first time in 50 years of marriage, I saw the man behind the mask, and he wasn't smiling anymore. Chapter 6. Leonard's shadow filled the lawyer's doorway. His voice, low and controlled, carried a danger I had never heard before. "Margaret, we need to leave. Now." Claire, the young attorney, rose to her feet, blocking him. "Sir, this is my office. You don't belong here." Leonard's eyes darted to the iPad on her desk. For a moment, I thought he might lunge across the room. But then, his mask slid back on, smooth as silk. "You're confused, Margaret," he said softly. "That's just boring company data. You've embarrassed yourself enough already." He extended his hand, but my fingers dug into the chair arms. For the first time in years, I didn't move. Claire broke the silence. "Mr. Parker, I'll be keeping copies of these files. If you threaten my client, you'll be threatening an officer of the court." His jaw tightened, but he forced a smile and left. The door clicked shut, and I exhaled, my body trembling. For decades, I had been silent. Now I had someone standing beside me. But that night, when I returned home, a note was taped to my refrigerator in Leonard's handwriting. "Careful who you trust." Chapter 7. Fear settled over me like a heavy quilt. I double-checked the locks, kept the curtains drawn, and walked my granddaughter to school every day with my eyes scanning the street. Yet in the quiet, I also felt a new flame inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. Claire began digging through the documents, and Harold, my old IT friend, recovered deleted files from the iPad. One of the files was a draft of a will. My name was gone. Instead, Leonard had left everything to a woman in Chicago and her son, the boy from the photographs. My breath caught. My husband hadn't just betrayed me. He had planned to erase me legally, to make me a ghost in my own life. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the will, my hands trembling. My granddaughter ran in, holding a crayon drawing of our house. "This is us, Grandma," she said. Us. The word broke me open. I had been erased on paper, but not in her eyes. Not yet. The next morning, a black car idled outside our house, engine running. And I knew they were watching us now. Chapter 9. The voice haunted me. I couldn't shake it. Who was she? The woman from the photos? A coworker? Or someone else Leonard had silenced? I confided in Claire, who urged caution. It could be a trap, she warned. But my gut told me otherwise. The next day, a letter slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a birth certificate. Father, Leonard Parker. Mother, Anna Ross. Child, Daniel Ross. My hands shook as I traced the ink. It was true. Leonard had a secret family in Chicago, and the boy was his son. I sank into my chair, tears hot on my cheeks. 50 years of marriage, and I was just one chapter in his double life. But then I noticed something else in the envelope, a photocopy of a contract, Leonard's signature next to payments marked consulting fees. They weren't consulting. They were bribes. I stared at the page until the lines blurred. My husband wasn't just unfaithful. He was criminal, dangerous, untouchable, or so he thought. That evening, Leonard stood in our doorway, suitcase in hand, and said, "Margaret, I want you gone by morning." Chapter 10. My knees buckled, but I steadied myself on the doorframe. "This is my house too," I said, my voice shaking. He laughed, cruel and sharp. "Not for long. Paperwork's already moving." He waved a folder in my face, thick with documents that erased me from everything I had helped build. But what he didn't know was that I had already made copies, stored safely with Claire. My silence was over. I met his eyes and whispered, "Not this time, Leonard." For the first time in our marriage, I saw fear crack his mask. The next morning, deputies arrived with a court order. Leonard's accounts were frozen, his access limited. He stormed out, shouting, "You'll regret this." But I wasn't trembling anymore. I felt something steadier, justice, creeping in quietly. Still, the fight was far from over. That night, Claire called me. "Margaret, you need to hear this," she said. "We've uncovered something bigger. The fraud isn't just Leonard's company. It reaches across state lines." And suddenly, I realized my battle wasn't just against my husband. It was against an entire machine that protected him. Chapter 11. The revelation hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just Leonard's secret scheme. It was a network, and he was only one piece of it. Claire laid out the files on her desk, showing how his company funneled money through shell corporations in Illinois, Indiana, and back to Chicago. "If this comes out," she said, "it won't just take down Leonard. It could unravel an entire circle of powerful men." That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen, the phone rang again. The same woman's voice whispered, "He ruined my life too. Don't stop." My hands trembled, but her words poured steel into my bones. For decades, I had been erased. Now, other erased voices were rising with me. But Leonard wasn't going down quietly. 2 nights later, my granddaughter and I returned home to find the door ajar, drawers overturned, papers scattered. The bread box where I once hid the iPad was empty. He had come for the evidence. And when I stepped into the bedroom, scrawled across the mirror in red marker were the words, "Silence or else." Chapter 12. Terror clawed at me, but so did fury. I called Claire, who insisted we move fast. She filed for an emergency protective order and demanded law enforcement secure the documents we had already submitted. "They can take the device," she said, "but not the truth." Still, the nights grew longer. I slept with the lights on, listening for footsteps. Every creak felt like Leonard's shadow. My granddaughter clutched her stuffed rabbit, whispering, "Grandma, is he coming back?" I told her no, but my voice cracked. Then, one morning, the news broke. Federal investigators had raided Parker Logistics headquarters in Chicago. Boxes of files, hard drives, contracts, all seized. Reporters swarmed the streets, shouting Leonard's name. My neighbors stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, whispering behind their curtains. But as the cameras rolled, Leonard walked out in handcuffs, head high, smiling as if he still owned the world. And when the reporters shoved microphones at me, asking what I knew, I had to decide, stay silent or speak the truth publicly for the first time in my life. Chapter 13. I stood on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing. My knees trembled, but my voice found strength I didn't know I had. For years, I was erased from my own life. But silence only protects the guilty. I won't be silent anymore. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For once, I wasn't the invisible wife. I was the witness. Inside, Leonard's lawyers tried everything, stalling, intimidating, waving their polished papers like weapons. But Claire presented the iPad files, the backdated contracts, the hidden accounts. Piece by piece, the mask slipped from Leonard's face. His business trips were exposed as rendezvous with his secret family. His consulting fees unmasked as bribes. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder. That night, alone in my living room, I wept, not for Leonard, but for the decades I had given him, believing silence was love. My granddaughter climbed onto my lap, whispering, "Grandma, you're brave." But just when I thought the storm was over, Claire called. "Margaret, there's a settlement offer. They want you to walk away quietly in exchange for millions. No testimony, no more trial." And once again, I had to choose comfort or justice. Chapter 14. The offer glittered like a poisoned jewel. Millions. Enough to live comfortably, to secure my granddaughter's future, to finally breathe without fear. But at what cost? I stared at the papers, my hands shaking. I had lived my whole life erased. To take this deal would be to erase myself again, this time with my own signature. I walked to the courthouse the next day, settlement papers in my purse. Leonard's lawyers smirked, certain they had won. He leaned close as I passed, whispering, "I always knew you'd fold." But when I reached the judge, I pulled out not the settlement, but the will Leonard had drafted erasing me. My voice rang out, "This is what silence looks like. I refuse." Gasps filled the courtroom. Leonard's smirk vanished. The judge ordered the trial to continue. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the clock ticking softly. I had chosen the harder path. But as I sipped my tea, I felt lighter than I had in 50 years. And then the phone rang. This time, not a whisper, but an investigator's voice. "Mrs. Parker, we need you to testify tomorrow. It will decide everything." Chapter 15. The courtroom was packed, cameras buzzing, the air thick with tension. I took the stand, my hands trembling but my voice steady. I told the truth about the iPad, the files, the secret family, the fraud, the threats, the decades of quiet erasure. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Leonard's polished facade. Leonard glared at me, his eyes burning with hatred, but I didn't flinch. I looked at the jurors, at the reporters, at every woman who had ever been told to stay silent. And I spoke for all of us. The verdict came down swift and heavy, guilty. Leonard was sentenced, his empire crumbled, his mask shattered. As he was led away in chains, I felt no joy, only a quiet, steady relief. I hadn't just survived. I had reclaimed my life. Back home in Dayton, I sat on my porch with my granddaughter, watching the sun set over the quiet street. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Grandma, you saved us." And for the first time, I believed her. Silence had been my prison. But truth was my freedom. If this story has touched you, remember, never let anyone erase you. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Stay tuned for more stories of quiet justice.